The Sullivan family vanished from their campsite in the late summer of 2009, leaving behind a scene so ordinary it haunted everyone who saw it. Their tent stood undisturbed in a clearing alongside the Niobrara River in north-central Nebraska, about 40 miles from the nearest town of Valentine. Inside, sleeping bags were still zipped halfway down, as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. A pot of half-eaten beans sat cooling on the grate above the campfire, which crackled softly, embers glowing orange against the gathering dusk. The family dog, a golden retriever named Biscuit, wandered the perimeter of the site, whimpering. Park Ranger Dale Hoffman discovered the abandoned campsite on September 12, 2009, during his evening patrol. He'd noticed the Sullivans' silver Honda Pilot in the lot that morning, but campfires weren't unusual. What struck him as wrong was the eerie stillness. No voices, no movement, and that dog pacing in circles. Dale approached cautiously, calling out. No response. He radioed the ranger station at 6:47 p.m., his voice tight with concern. Within an hour, local law enforcement and the county sheriff's department had descended on the scene. Before we continue with this mystery, if you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. The Sullivan family consisted of 4 people: Richard Sullivan, 41, a high school history teacher from Omaha, his wife Karen, 39, who worked as a librarian, their daughter Lily, 14, a freshman with dreams of becoming a veterinarian, and their son Jacob, 11, a quiet boy who loved fishing. According to family members, the Sullivans had planned this camping trip for weeks. They'd left their home in Omaha early on the morning of September 10th, telling neighbors they'd be back by Monday evening. Richard had been looking forward to teaching Jacob how to fly fish in the clear waters of the Niobrara, while Karen wanted to disconnect from the demands of the school year that had just begun. Investigators immediately began cataloging the scene. Everything appeared untouched. Richard's tackle box sat open beside a folding chair, lures still neatly organized. Karen's paperback novel rested face down on a camp table, bookmarked at page 187. Lily's journal lay inside the tent, the last entry dated September 11th, describing how beautiful the stars had been the previous night. Jacob's fishing rod leaned against a tree, line still baited. Their cooler contained fresh food, sandwiches, fruit, bottles of water. Nothing had been disturbed by animals. The family's cell phones were found in the vehicle, all powered off, which was typical for people trying to disconnect. But their wallets, identification, and car keys were also in the Pilot, which troubled the investigators deeply. Sheriff Tom Bergstrom, a 26-year veteran who'd seen his share of missing persons cases, stood in the fading light and felt a chill run down his spine. "It's like they were raptured," he muttered to Deputy Linda Kowalczyk, who was photographing the scene. Linda didn't respond, but she understood what he meant. People didn't just vanish mid-meal. She'd worked a case 5 years earlier where a hiker had gotten lost, but there were always signs. Disturbed vegetation, dropped items, some indication of direction. Here, there was nothing. The ground around the campsite was hard-packed dirt and grass, not ideal for tracking, but the search dogs would arrive by morning. The investigation expanded rapidly. By dawn on September 13th, more than 60 volunteers had joined law enforcement in combing the surrounding wilderness. The terrain along the Niobrara River was challenging. Dense stands of ponderosa pine mixed with cottonwoods, steep ravines carved by centuries of water flow, and thick underbrush that could conceal almost anything. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept overhead in grid patterns, searching for heat signatures. Search and rescue teams on horseback covered the trails, while others waded through the cold river, probing beneath overhanging banks where a body might have snagged. The FBI arrived on September 14th, bringing additional resources and expertise. Special Agent in Charge Robert Diaz set up a command center at the local fire station in Valentine, coordinating efforts between multiple agencies. He ordered a comprehensive background check on the Sullivan family, looking for any indication of foul play, domestic issues, or financial problems that might explain a planned disappearance. What they found painted a picture of an utterly ordinary American family. Richard had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. Karen volunteered at a women's shelter twice a month. The kids were well-adjusted, good students with friends and active social lives. Their bank accounts showed no unusual transactions, no large withdrawals, no evidence of planning to run away. Interviews with other campers who'd been in the area that weekend yielded frustrating results. A retired couple from Iowa, the Hendersons, had been camping about half a mile downstream. They reported seeing the Sullivan family on the afternoon of September 11th, watching them fish from a distance. "They looked happy," Mrs. Henderson told investigators, her voice breaking. The kids were laughing. The father was teaching the boy how to cast. It was just normal. The Hendersons had gone to bed around 9 p.m. and heard nothing unusual during the night. No screams, no vehicles, no sounds of struggle. A young couple, Brett and Ashley Cunningham, had hiked past the Sullivan campsite around sunset on September 11th. They remembered the campfire and smelling something cooking. "We waved," Brett recalled, "but we didn't see anyone. We figured they were in the tent or down by the water. We didn't think anything of it." They estimated the time at approximately 7:30 p.m., which meant the Sullivans were likely still at the campsite then, or at least the fire had been recently tended. The search continued for 2 full weeks, involving over 200 personnel at its peak. Divers explored the deeper pools of the Niobrara. Cave rescue specialists checked the small limestone caverns that dotted the area. Every abandoned structure within a 20-mile radius was searched. Cadaver dogs were brought in, but they found nothing. It was as if the Sullivan family had simply ceased to exist at that campsite, leaving behind all their earthly possessions, but taking nothing with them. Not their shoes, not their jackets, nothing. As September gave way to October, the active search was scaled back, though the case remained open and active. Sheriff Bergstrom held a press conference on October 1st, his face drawn with exhaustion and frustration. "We have followed every lead, explored every possibility," he said, his voice steady but tight. "The Sullivan family has not been found, and we have no evidence of what happened to them, but we will not give up. We will continue to investigate every piece of information that comes in." Behind him stood Richard's brother, Michael Sullivan, and Karen's sister, Patricia Reeves, both barely holding themselves together. The investigation took a turn when forensic analysts examining the campsite discovered something peculiar. In the dirt near the fire pit, partially obscured by ash, they found a partial boot print that didn't match any of the Sullivan family's footwear. The print belonged to a size 12 work boot, heavy-treaded, likely a Wolverine or similar brand. Richard wore size 10 running shoes. This discovery breathed new life into the investigation, suggesting that someone else had been at the campsite. Detectives began canvassing local businesses, showing photos of the Sullivan family and asking if anyone had seen them or noticed anyone following them. At a bait shop in Valentine, the owner, an elderly man named Curtis Webb, remembered the family. "Nice folks," he said. "Bought night crawlers and some tackle." The little boy was excited about catching his first trout, but Curtis also remembered something else. There was another fellow in here that day, maybe an hour after them. Didn't buy anything, just kind of browsed. He asked me if I knew where people usually camped along the Niobrara. I told him there were several good spots. He was a big guy, quiet, kept his cap pulled low. I didn't think much of it at the time. Working with Curtis's description, a sketch artist produced a composite image of the man, broad-shouldered, approximately 6 feet tall, mid-30s to mid-40s, wearing a dark baseball cap and sunglasses. The sketch was released to the media on October 15th, generating hundreds of tips. Most led nowhere, cases of mistaken identity, or people trying to be helpful but providing vague information. However, one tip stood out. A woman named Gloria Ramsey called the tip line from Lincoln, Nebraska. She'd been visiting her mother in Valentine the weekend of September 11th and had stopped at a gas station on Highway 20. While filling her tank, she'd noticed a man matching the sketch, sitting in a dark green pickup truck with South Dakota plates. What caught her attention was how intently he'd been watching a family loading camping gear into their vehicle at the next pump. "It stuck with me because it seemed odd," Gloria told Detective Frank Larson. "He wasn't just glancing, he was staring, and when I looked at him, he turned away real quick and drove off." Gloria's description of the family matched the Sullivans, 2 adults, 2 children, a silver SUV. Detective Larson felt a surge of hope. If this man had been following the Sullivan family, it would explain the boot print and potentially provide a suspect. But identifying a dark green pickup with South Dakota plates from a partial description proved nearly impossible. Thousands of such vehicles existed in the region. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit developed a profile of a potential suspect. If the Sullivans had been abducted, the perpetrator would likely be someone familiar with the area, comfortable in wilderness settings, and possessing the physical capability to control 4 people. The profile suggested a male, likely with a history of violence or sexual offenses, possibly someone who lived in the region or frequented it for work. Cross-referencing this profile with databases of known offenders in Nebraska and South Dakota produced several dozen names. Among those names was Leonard "Lenny" Pritchard, a 43-year-old ranch hand who worked on various properties throughout the region. Lenny had a criminal record, a conviction for aggravated assault in 1998, for which he'd served 3 years, and an arrest for stalking in 2003 that had been pleaded down to harassment. He owned a dark green Ford F-150 with South Dakota plates. He'd been working at a ranch approximately 30 miles from the Niobrara River campground in early September 2009. Investigators located Lenny in early November at a ranch outside of Gordon, Nebraska. He was brought in for questioning on November 8th. Detective Larson and Special Agent Diaz conducted the interview in a small room at the sheriff's office. Lenny was a large man, easily 6'2", with calloused hands and a weathered face. He wore size 12 work boots, Wolverine brand. "Lenny, we want to ask you about the weekend of September 11th, Detective Larson began, his tone conversational. "Do you remember where you were?" Lenny shifted in his chair, his expression guarded. "I was working. I work most weekends." When asked specifically about the Sullivan family, Lenny claimed he'd never heard of them. Shown the photos, he shook his head. "Don't know them." But when asked about the bait shop in Valentine, Lenny hesitated just a fraction too long before denying he'd been there. The interview lasted 4 hours. Lenny's story remained consistent. He'd been working at the ranch, hadn't left the property that weekend, knew nothing about the missing family. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene beyond the boot print, which was only a partial match and could belong to dozens of men in the area, investigators couldn't hold him. They released him but maintained surveillance. Over the following weeks, investigators obtained warrants to search Lenny's truck and the small trailer where he lived. The truck's interior was worn but clean, recently vacuumed. Too clean, Detective Larson thought. They found nothing. No blood, no fibers, no evidence. The trailer was similarly sparse. Lenny owned few possessions, moved frequently for work, lived a solitary life. Neighbors described him as quiet, kept to himself, occasionally drank too much at the local bar, but never caused trouble. The case began to stall. Winter descended on Nebraska, covering the search area in snow. The command center was closed, resources redirected to other cases. The FBI maintained a presence, but the daily urgency faded. For the Sullivan family's relatives, this was unbearable. Michael Sullivan, Richard's brother, took a leave of absence from his job as an accountant and dedicated himself to finding answers. He created a website, printed flyers, drove to the campsite repeatedly, walking the trails and riverbanks, calling out their names. Patricia Reeves, Karen's sister, appeared on national news programs, pleading for information. "Someone knows something," she said, her eyes red from crying. "4 people don't just disappear. Please, if you saw anything, heard anything, come forward. We need to bring them home." The story was featured on several crime shows, generating renewed interest and tips, but nothing concrete emerged. In March 2010, 6 months after the disappearance, a hiker discovered something along a tributary of the Niobrara River, about 8 miles from the Sullivan campsite. Partially buried in mud and debris from spring runoff was a child's sneaker, pink and white, size 6. Lily Sullivan had been wearing pink and white sneakers when she disappeared. The shoe was recovered and sent to the FBI lab for analysis. The results confirmed it was Lily's shoe. DNA from skin cells inside the sneaker matched the DNA profile created from samples taken from the Sullivan home. This discovery reignited the search. Teams returned to the area, focusing on the tributary and its path. If Lily's shoe had washed downstream, perhaps the bodies were somewhere upstream. The terrain was rugged, the water cold and fast in early spring. Searchers worked methodically, examining every pool, every log jam, every undercut bank. They found nothing else. The single shoe became another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. Had Lily lost it while trying to escape? Had someone removed it and thrown it in the water? The theories multiplied, each more troubling than the last. In June 2010, the case took another unexpected turn. A convicted burglar named Travis Olmsted, serving time in the Nebraska State Penitentiary, reached out to investigators claiming he had information about the Sullivan family. Detective Larson and Special Agent Diaz drove to Lincoln to interview him. Travis was a small-time criminal, in and out of jail for most of his adult life, with no history of violence. "I heard things," Travis said, speaking through the plexiglass divider. "There's talk. Some of the guys in here, they know things." When pressed for specifics, Travis claimed that a man he'd met in county jail in early 2010 had bragged about getting rid of a family in the woods. The man's name was Danny Volker, and he'd been released in February after serving 90 days for DUI. Investigators tracked down Danny Volker to a trailer park outside of Scottsbluff, Nebraska. Danny, 38, was unemployed, had a long record of alcohol-related offenses, and fit the general description from the bait shop, though so did many men in rural Nebraska. Brought in for questioning, Danny vehemently denied any involvement. "That guy in jail is lying," Danny insisted. "I never said nothing like that. I don't know anything about any missing family." His alibi for September 2009 was weak. He'd been around, maybe in Colorado, maybe Wyoming. He couldn't remember exactly. He'd been drinking heavily that year. Without corroborating evidence, Danny's denials held. Travis Olmsted's credibility was questionable. He was known for making up stories to get attention or benefits within the prison system. The lead evaporated, leaving investigators frustrated once again. Years passed. The case remained open but grew cold. Anniversaries came and went, marked by vigils organized by the Sullivan and Reeves families. Michael Sullivan never stopped searching, spending weekends driving through Nebraska, South Dakota, and Wyoming, showing photos, asking questions. Patricia Reeves lobbied for continued media coverage, keeping the story alive in the public consciousness. In 2014, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A retired ranger from the Niobrara area who'd moved to Arizona contacted the sheriff's office. His name was Walter Green, and he'd been thinking about the Sullivan case for years. Something had bothered him, a detail he'd dismissed at the time but couldn't shake. In the weeks before the Sullivans disappeared, Walter had noticed a dark green pickup truck parked at various trailheads and overlooks along the river. He'd seen it multiple times, always empty, never with a camper or gear visible. It had struck him as odd because most people parked at those spots to hike or fish, but this truck would sit for hours with no one around. Walter had even written down the license plate number once, intending to check if the vehicle had been reported stolen, but he'd gotten busy and forgotten. He'd found the old notebook while packing to move and saw the number, a South Dakota plate. He provided it to investigators, apologizing for not coming forward sooner. The license plate traced back to Leonard Pritchard. The truck had been registered to him in 2008. This wasn't enough for an arrest. Lenny had every right to drive around public lands, but it established a pattern of behavior that fit the profile. Investigators renewed their focus on Lenny. By 2014, he was working on a ranch in Montana, still moving frequently, still living alone. A new generation of detectives took over the case. Detective Amy Chen and her partner, Detective Ray Holbrook, reviewed every piece of evidence, every interview, every tip. They became convinced that Lenny Pritchard was their man, but they needed proof. They traveled to Montana and conducted surveillance, watching Lenny's routines, looking for any slip, any connection to the Sullivans. In late 2015, advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence from the campsite. Using new techniques, forensic specialists were able to extract touch DNA from the handle of Richard Sullivan's tackle box, DNA that hadn't been there when the family packed it. The profile didn't match Richard, Karen, Lily, or Jacob. It didn't match any of the searchers or investigators who'd processed the scene, as all had been excluded through reference samples collected during the original investigation. The DNA was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. There was no match. Lenny Pritchard had never been convicted of a felony that would require him to submit DNA, so he wasn't in the system. Investigators needed a voluntary sample or probable cause for a warrant. Detective Chen devised a plan. In early 2016, she and Detective Holbrook approached Lenny at the ranch in Montana, where he worked. They were cordial, explained that they were closing out old cases and doing routine follow-ups. They asked if Lenny would voluntarily provide a DNA sample to be excluded from the investigation. Lenny, sitting on the porch of the bunkhouse, stared at them for a long moment. "I already talked to you people years ago," he said slowly. "I don't know nothing about that family." When asked directly if he'd provide a DNA sample, Lenny stood up. "I think I should talk to a lawyer," he said, and walked inside. His refusal wasn't illegal, but it strengthened investigators' suspicions. They returned to Nebraska and began building a case for a warrant. They compiled everything: the boot print, the sightings of his truck, Walter Green's testimony, the timeline that placed him in the area, his criminal history, his evasive behavior during interviews. In September 2016, exactly 7 years after the Sullivan family disappeared, a judge issued a warrant for Lenny Pritchard's DNA. Lenny was located and served the warrant. He complied without protest, his expression unreadable as a technician swabbed the inside of his cheek. The sample was sent to the FBI lab. The wait was agonizing for the investigators and the families. 8 weeks later, the results came back. The DNA from the tackle box was a match to Leonard Pritchard. On November 18, 2016, Lenny Pritchard was arrested at the Montana ranch and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 4 counts of kidnapping. He was extradited to Nebraska, where he sat in the county jail awaiting trial. The arrest made national headlines. Michael Sullivan and Patricia Reeves held a press conference. their emotions a mixture of relief and anguish. "We have someone in custody," Michael said, his voice shaking. "But we still don't have Richard, Karen, Lily, and Jacob. We still don't have answers about what happened to them. We need to know where they are." Lenny Pritchard maintained his innocence. His court-appointed attorney argued that the DNA on the tackle box could have been transferred innocently. Perhaps Lenny had touched the box while browsing at the bait shop, or through some other incidental contact. The prosecution countered that the evidence was overwhelming. The DNA, the truck sightings, the pattern of behavior, the lack of alibi. The trial was set for June 2017. As the trial date approached, prosecutors made a decision. They offered Lenny a deal: plead guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder and in exchange tell them where the bodies were. Lenny would receive a life sentence but would be spared the possibility of the death penalty. The families desperately wanted this. They needed closure, needed to bury their loved ones. Lenny Pritchard sat in the interrogation room with his attorney, considering the offer. Detective Chen sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. "Lenny, those kids deserve to be put to rest," she said quietly. "Their parents deserve a proper burial. You can give that to the families. You can do one decent thing." Lenny stared at the table for a long time, his jaw working. Finally, he looked up. "I want the deal in writing," he said. On May 22, 2017, Leonard Pritchard stood before the judge and pleaded guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder. His voice was flat as he admitted that on the evening of September 11, 2009, he had approached the Sullivan family's campsite. He'd been watching them, following them. He claimed he only intended to rob them, to take their vehicle and whatever valuables they had. But Richard Sullivan had confronted him, and things had gotten out of hand. Lenny described a struggle, claimed he'd panicked, that everything happened fast. He said he'd forced the family into their vehicle at gunpoint, driven them to a remote location, and killed them. He'd disposed of their bodies in an abandoned mine shaft approximately 60 miles northwest of the campsite, in a desolate area of the Pine Ridge region. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Patricia Reeves sobbing. Michael Sullivan sat rigid, his face pale, hands clenched into fists. Lenny's confession was clinical, devoid of emotion or remorse. When the judge asked if he had anything to say to the families, Lenny shook his head. Following Lenny's directions, a recovery team consisting of law enforcement, forensic specialists, and mine safety experts traveled to the location he'd described. The mine shaft was on private land, long abandoned, its entrance partially collapsed and overgrown with vegetation. It took 3 days of careful excavation to make the shaft safe enough to enter. On May 28, 2017, searchers descended into the darkness. They found the Sullivan family at the bottom of the shaft, approximately 80 feet down. The bodies were badly decomposed after nearly 8 years, but identification was possible through dental records and DNA. Richard, Karen, Lily, and Jacob Sullivan were finally coming home. The recovery was painstaking, conducted with as much dignity as possible. Each body was brought to the surface in a separate operation, treated with respect and care. The autopsies confirmed Lenny's confession in broad strokes, but revealed details he'd omitted. Each member of the Sullivan family had died from gunshot wounds to the head. The medical examiner determined they'd been killed execution-style, likely forced to kneel before being shot. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no indication of prolonged suffering. It appeared Lenny had killed them quickly, one after another, then disposed of their bodies in the mine shaft. The family's vehicle had been driven to a chop shop in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where it was dismantled and sold for parts. The owner of the shop, when confronted with this information years later, claimed he'd bought the vehicle from a man he didn't know, paid cash, no questions asked. He couldn't identify Lenny from photos, and investigators believed he was telling the truth. He'd been an unwitting accomplice in covering up the crime. On June 15, 2017, the Sullivan family was laid to rest in a cemetery in Omaha. Hundreds of people attended the funeral: friends, family, former students of Richard's, patrons of the library where Karen had worked, classmates of Lily and Jacob. The caskets were closed, the grief overwhelming. Michael Sullivan delivered a eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke about his brother's love of teaching, Karen's gentle kindness, Lily's bright future, and Jacob's quiet curiosity. "They were taken from us by evil," Michael said, tears streaming down his face. "But they will never be forgotten. They will live on in our hearts, in our memories, in the love we shared with them." Leonard Pritchard was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security facility where he remains today. He has never expressed remorse, never explained why he targeted the Sullivan family specifically. Psychologists who evaluated him described him as having antisocial personality disorder, lacking empathy and deriving satisfaction from control and domination. The theory that emerged from the investigation was that Lenny had been stalking campers in the Niobrara area for some time, watching families, possibly fantasizing about violence. The Sullivans had been unlucky enough to catch his attention. He'd followed them, observed them, and on that September evening he'd acted on his impulses. The case left scars on everyone involved. Detective Chen, who dedicated years to finding the truth, retired shortly after the trial, unable to shake the images of those 4 bodies in the mineshaft. Sheriff Bergstrom, who'd been among the first to see the abandoned campsite, said in an interview that he still thought about the Sullivans every time he drove past the Niobrara River. "You want to believe that justice was served," he said. "But it doesn't feel like justice when 4 innocent people are dead. It feels like failure." The Sullivan case led to changes in how missing persons cases are handled in rural areas. Law enforcement agencies improved communication and coordination, particularly regarding DNA evidence and databases. Campgrounds in the region increased ranger patrols, and educational programs were developed to teach campers about safety and awareness. But no amount of policy change could bring back Richard, Karen, Lily, and Jacob. Michael Sullivan established a foundation in his brother's name, dedicated to helping families of missing persons navigate the often overwhelming process of searching for loved ones. The foundation provides resources, coordinates volunteer search efforts, and advocates for legislative changes to improve missing persons investigations. Patricia Reeves became a victims' rights advocate, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of awareness and reporting suspicious behavior. The campsite where the Sullivan family spent their last hours was never used again. The Forest Service eventually closed that section of the campground, citing environmental concerns. But everyone knew the real reason. The place had become a memorial, a reminder of lives cut short and evil that lurks in unexpected places. Occasionally, people leave flowers there, small tokens tied to trees. A children's book for Lily and Jacob, a fishing lure for Richard, a bookmark for Karen. The Niobrara River continues to flow, indifferent to human tragedy, its waters clear and cold. In the end, the Sullivan family's story is one of profound loss and the resilience of those left behind. It's a reminder that evil exists, that danger can strike even in moments of peace and beauty, and that the fight for justice, though long and painful, is never in vain. Richard, Karen, Lily, and Jacob Sullivan are gone, but they are not forgotten. Their names are spoken with love and sorrow, their memories cherished by those who knew them and even by strangers who learned their story. The campfire that crackled softly on that September evening in 2009 has long since turned to ash. But the light of their lives, brief though it was, continues to shine in the hearts of those who refuse to let darkness have the final word.